Hi, and welcome back to Just Ask the Question. I am your host, Brian Karen. With me is Janessa Goldbeck, the CEO of Vet Voice Foundation. Welcome back to the show, Janessa. I love having you back. I'm going to hit you with this. The Donald Trump has threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act in Minnesota. And I know this is not about restoring any calm. He says there's danger there, but there was no danger and no violence until he got there with ICE and has militarized. And that's the other thing I want to talk about. Is ICE acting as the military or as police? Because it doesn't seem like this is a police action. It seems more like it's an invasion and every American is targeted as an enemy. But you released a statement today, and I'd like to ask you to just tell me what it was and why you did it.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Brian. Always great to be
Oh,
here.
it's always a pleasure to have you.
As a Marine Corps veteran, someone who served, this has been a challenge for us to see over the last year or so. The president consistently putting the military into the streets or attempting to put the military into the streets. We saw it with various National Guard deployments. Courts have pushed back on a lot of those deployments, the federalization of Guard forces, but the president has been, testing the legal boundaries of what we accept in America and frankly, what society will accept. But the threat to use the Insurrection Act is a whole different ball of wax. The Insurrection Act is an extraordinary power. It provides the president with the exceptional ability to suspend or avoid posse comitatus, which is a law we have in the United States that prevents the military from doing civilian police work. So it would ostensibly
Passed by Republicans in the wake of the Civil War, but yeah, never mind. Just for historical,
different Republicans.
Yeah.
But we will, but it's one of the most extreme domestic authorities available to the president. And over the last 2 centuries of American history, it's been used infrequently as an extraordinary response to severe domestic disorder or a failure of states to enforce federal laws, like we saw in the Civil Rights era. But what's remained constant about its use is that it's treated as an extraordinary power. It's not something that we're just going to deploy willy-nilly when the president doesn't like the politics of a protest. And that is unfortunately what we're seeing in Minnesota. So, it's a really dangerous escalation. It's not about bringing peace. Just as the federalization of the National Guard in Portland, Chicago, and Los Angeles was an escalation, done against the wishes of local law enforcement and local leaders, this is extraordinarily inflammatory and should concern every American.
Well, I'm going to just read from your statement that you issued. The president's threat to invoke the Insurrection Act in Minnesota is not about restoring calm or keeping people safe. It is part of a pattern of provocation, escalation, and threats of force designed to justify using the military against Americans. And that's the point I have heard from the White House saying that the military supports what we're doing because it's keeping order, and that the people that are doing this are immune from prosecution because they're merely following the law. But I've covered law enforcement and the military for 4 decades. And I have this again looks to me like a military incursion and not a policing effort, which places us all in jeopardy. Because if you're on a seek and destroy mission as a member of the military, you know well that you're there to neutralize targets, and you're not pulling up going, hey, I don't know if you're a member of of my opponents or not, but gosh, can you pull over to the side of the road? You're assuming that people are the enemy and you're neutralizing targets, which you have to do to survive. To me, you tell me, you have the military experience. Are the actions of ICE those of a police department or those of a paramilitary organization?
There are definitely not conducting law enforcement actions, smashing the windows of people sitting in parked cars, shooting at civilians, kidnapping people, throwing them in unmarked vehicles, entering homes without judicial warrants. Like, none of that is law enforcement. And that I want to be clear that so far the president has not invoked the Insurrection Act. We haven't seen actually National Guard in the streets yet of Minnesota, and hopefully we will not. or active duty military. But the ICE agents are wearing paramilitary uniforms. They are intentionally in military fatigues with their faces covered. And so for the average citizen or civilian who is encountering these folks, they
Right.
look like the military. They're not necessarily able to draw the distinction. But they're acting with very little training. We've all read the stories about the incentive bonuses. The fact that there was a story that broke yesterday of an Afghanistan war veteran who went to an ICE recruiting fair just to see what it was like, and ended up getting a job offer with no background check, nothing. And they had written extensively, like very anti-ICE pieces. So a quick Google search could have pulled that up, but they got offered a job. So that tells you, what kind of background checks are happening with these folks. When President Trump told the Proud Boys to, stand by, this is the opportunity they were looking for, to go out and smash heads and do it with absolute impunity. I mean, you had the Secretary Noem today saying that American citizens should be prepared to carry around their citizenship documents. I mean, that is not what a free and fair society looks like. That is not the America or the values of freedom that I served to protect and defend.
Yes, that's the other part that I wanted to ask you. In today's press briefing, the PEP secretary, Caroline Levitt, came out and said that ICE is 100% right 100% of the time, and that to ask any questions about the fact that they've detained American citizens, shot and killed an American citizen, or have harassed American citizens indicates that I'm a member of the crooked media. Um, I haven't seen anything like it. Look, I talked to a lot of veterans, in a statement that you made, trained to de-escalate and build trust in civilian communities. This is not building trust. This is not a de-escalating events by the very nature. I have said that this is not political, it's procedural, that they are not following the procedures of either the military or the police. These people are just wildly going out. I mean, it's pretty obvious to me. Your thoughts?
Absolutely. I mean, look, this is to say that the ICE has ultimate impunity, that there is no responsibility held, that anyone who speaks out against ICE or their actions or this president or films or shouts something at the ICE agents is a member of the crooked media or a domestic terrorist or inciting violence. I mean, this is pure authoritarian bullshit. Like, this is not America. And Trump and even the lots of folks on the right have said that the most important thing for them is free speech, but then they're willing to accept this when it's coming from the president of the United States. I mean, look, people are welcome to their political beliefs. There are people I know and debate on a daily basis who have very different beliefs than I do, or ideas about how the world should be run. But we can agree that we should be able to protest things that we disagree with, that we should be able to signal our dissent, that we should be able to fight back in the courts, and the rule of law should exist. And this administration is just increasingly leaning into a lawlessness and an anti-American orientation towards freedom that is incredibly alarming. And to think about how that might play out in relation to the 2026 election is really what keeps me up at night.
Yeah, and me. I'm afraid they'll use declare an insurrection or use martial law or the Insurrection Act, and especially in blue cities, to try and suppress the vote. That's a very real concern. But my big question for you: I'm told daily, I mean daily, that the military is with Donald Trump, that they know that he's doing the right thing and enforcing the laws. You represent you represent veterans. Do a majority of veterans believe that this is supporting the rule of law in the United States and the Constitution?
The statement that the military is with the president on its own is pretty alarming, because the military is supposed to be an apolitical force. By law, they are required to follow lawful orders, and also by law required to refuse illegal orders. But the idea that the military stands with a political leader is antithetical to the way that we have oriented the military in this country, and for good cause. We want the military to remain an apolitical force, but this president has been hell-bent on politicizing the military from the very first days of his administration. I mean, this feels like 100 years ago, but remember the military parade on Trump's birthday, the
Yeah.
rally at Bragg, where he made extraordinarily partisan comments and actually sold partisan Donald Trump merch, all the way to Pete Hegseth, calling all the generals in to rail at them about his own political beliefs, and having that backdrop of all the generals sitting there, which I think may have backfired on him. I think he wanted that to look like they supported him, and it certainly didn't come off like that. To now, the statements that the administration is making about, the president in the military is 100% with the military. Look, like, veterans are reflective of American society. I'm not going to say that every veteran or person in uniform agrees with me, but we represent a broad swath of American society. We're from all walks of life, and that means our politics are different. But at the very end of the day, we all swore an oath to protect and defend the Constitution and the values enshrined in it. And the actions of this administration are completely 180 degrees away from the values that freedom of speech, of freedom of assembly, freedom of protest, all those things. And so I find it, there's a lot of polling that shows that Americans are not in favor of National Guard deployments in American cities. There's a new poll that was out today. I saw that 75% of Americans are against Trump's escalatory, imperialistic march towards war in Venezuela or in Greenland or wherever else is next. People want the military to be powerful and strong and used when it is absolutely necessary and a tool of last resort. And we want our troops and our soldiers and Marines and everyone else in uniform to be prepared to go fight bad guys and execute missions overseas, not to be turned inward, used against the American populace, used to intimidate and frighten and jail political opponents. That is what happens in Russia. That's what happens in North Korea. That is not what is supposed to happen in the United States of America.
So what happens if you're a veteran and say you create a videotape urging people not to break the law and to follow the Constitution, and Pete Hegseth would go after you? I know that sounds like a wild idea, but
what kind of crazy hypothetical is that?
Yeah.
Listen, I mean, look, just like on its face, there's tons of videotape. There's at least 2 videos that I've seen of Pete Hegseth prior to being Secretary of Defense talking about how troops have an obligation to refuse an illegal order. That is just a straight up truth. It's it's part of the UCMJ. It's a briefing that I went to officer candidate school at Quantico, and as part of your initial training, I remember sitting through the class where they talked to us about the UCMJ and our legal obligations under the law. And that's just a fact. Now, the fact that they've gone after Senator Kelly, and now, Alyssa Slotkin released something yesterday that she's under investigation for something related. The intent, they know they're outside the boundaries of the law. They know that there is no way to, they dropped the court martial because there was no grounds for it. Now they're going after this administrative censure. And whether or not they are able to do that successfully in this administration, I know Senator Kelly has filed a lawsuit fighting back. But the intent is to chill dissent. It is to send a signal to anyone who's ever worn a uniform that your voice doesn't. If you speak out, you might lose your benefits, you might lose your retirement paycheck. And just the mere act, whether or not they're successful, of targeting Senator Kelly and targeting Senator Slotkin may actually chill people's willingness to speak out. But it says a lot about what they think about veterans, how afraid they are of veterans speaking out, which is why it's so important for those of us who have worn the uniform to continue to do so. It says a lot that they're targeting Senator Kelly because he is a decorated combat veteran and an astronaut, that they're coming for him. So I'm so proud that Senator Kelly is standing up and fighting back and making it clear that he's not going to be cowed by this administration and their threats.
Do you think that it will have the desired effect to chill free speech, or do you believe, or do you think that there might be a reaction, almost a physical reaction? For every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction. Do you think that that's a possibility? Because a lot of people that I've spoken with, former military veterans, has said this really pisses them off. Your statement today tells me, you're not real happy with it either. Do you see a growing resistance, or do you think that this will have the intended effect of chilling free speech? How do you
Oh,
think that goes?
I think it's pissing a lot of people off, and that's reflected in the numbers of people we're seeing in the streets, whether it's around the No Kings protest or even just everyday citizens showing up in Minneapolis, heading to the streets. You know, I've seen interview after interview on social media of veterans who are out there protesting and saying, like, this is not what America's supposed to be. This is not what we fought to protect and defend. And in fact, this is what we've seen in other countries that we have been,
Right.
fighting against or trying to liberate, their civilians. So it's just, I really think that people are pissed off. And even if you are a Trump supporter, this is really goes against a lot of the things he campaigned on. You know, he campaigned on attacks on free speech. He campaigned on ending forever wars and not getting the U.S. embroiled in additional conflicts.
The
And now
peace president.
now he's the
Yeah.
president. He owns this, and he is
Yeah.
actively pursuing it in a way that is, I hope that people will open their eyes and see what's happening before them, and as things start happening in their own cities, in their own backyards, it becomes impossible to ignore. So I have a lot of hope that this will inspire action, and that people will find courage. Courage begets courage. So when people do courageous things like Senator Kelly and fight back to the person, the man on the street or woman on the street who is out there with a whistle protecting their neighbors, that inspires other people to get involved. And I hope we'll see more of that.
So do you see? I guess the question then becomes, what type of action do you see that needs to be taken prior to and including the midterm elections, and be long term? Do you think that Donald Trump succeeds in his efforts, or do you believe that real Americans can stand up and thwart the authoritarian regime?
We have to take our lessons from other activists, other resistance actors in other countries who have stood up against autocracy and kleptocracy, and fought back. I do think that one really unifying theme around this presidency that has mobilized people on both the left and right and has a lot of potential is how corrupt this administration truly is. They are using every lever possible to line their own pockets. There's a reason why Venezuela was a target early on, and it's not about freedom or fentanyl. It's about oil and everything that this president and his family stand to gain. And so I think that as we journalists, activists, people with a platform can focus in on all of the ways that this administration is enriching themselves at the expense of us, American citizens, people who are just building a better life for themselves and their families, and want a stable, secure country, not this insane drama and violence and fear that this administration is bringing to our streets and to our homes and to our communities. So I really, I think that they ultimately, how successful they are depends on how strong we are in terms of our response. And this is unprecedented in American history. That feels so trite to say, but it truly is. And we need to take the moment at face value. We're no longer living in a democracy, or we are living in a kleptocracy, and one that requires all of us to operate a little differently and think about how we solve problems and how we build coalitions a little differently.
And so then do you think that Donald Trump will call the troops to go into Greenland? And B, how would you think that the military would react should he do so?
Well, I'm a big believer in listening to what Donald Trump says and taking him seriously. He has everything that he said that has sounded crazy, he has tried to do. In the past, there were serious folks around him who may have constrained him. That is not true in this administration. And so we are seeing
that no one's trying to constrain him, or that no one's sane is around him. I think both could be true.
Whichever it is, it does not bode well for American security and prosperity. And so, he's saying that, he came out of the meeting earlier today or yesterday. It's been a whirlwind 24 hours, saying,
Yes.
That it was a productive meeting, but Donald Trump still thinks seizing Greenland is a strategic priority for the United States. Whether or not that's boots on the ground or something more, something more discreet, I don't know. But I will tell you that we are planning a tabletop exercise with a number of NATO and security experts, bipartisan, to game that out and how that might actually play out and what the implications would be for the U.S. economy and for people living here.
Well, two things come to mind. France and Denmark, England, they're all going to go send troops to game things out in Greenland. They're putting troops there. It would be the end of NATO if and no one would benefit more from the end of NATO than who? Oh, that would be Vladimir Putin. So, I mean, I see what the end game here is and why it's being played. But one of the things I remember most about growing up as a kid was the fact that I'm actually seeing headlines now about who would be the first drafted in World War III. They're gaming out the potential for a worldwide conflict. And I saw The Day After. I know what, I know exactly what nuclear winter is. And I don't see a World War III as a traditional, infantry, boots on the ground, tanks. I see it as two guys pressing a button, and the next thing you know, we're all living in caves and hunting for food. We're hunters and gatherers. Who's ever left who hasn't died of radiation? I mean, that to me is where, when you're considering escalation of the military, what happened to the mutually assured destruction policy? Is that something that we're still aware of, at least in the military? It seems like there is a certain younger generation and certain politicians of my generation that seem to have forgotten that. But please tell me that the military is still aware of it.
I mean, the military is, but the political leadership in charge of the military seems pretty trigger happy to me. And look, I mean, Donald Trump having the nuclear codes on its face is terrifying. Like that's something that doesn't get discussed enough. This is a guy who, the last person who speaks in his ear is the thing he believes and says out loud. And he is surrounded by folks who want to escalate, want to grift, want to get something, and seem to have no regard for, let alone the Constitution or the law, but human life, empathy, like what it's like, creating a place that is a good place to live for everyone. I just, there's a lot of horrible outcomes. I would say I try not to spend, in my professional life, I think a lot about the worst case scenario. That's kind of my job, and to help prepare decision makers and elected leaders to be able to respond in real time. But, it's also important to touch grass and get outside and breathe air, because when you really start looking at who's in charge of this administration, I mean, the inmates are running the asylum.
I don't even know if they're inmates. I think they're the rats that the inmates ate, but that's just me. Listen, I'd like you to plug whatever it is that you'd like to plug, and tell me, how can people assist your organizations?
Sure. Well, the name of our organization is Vent Voice Foundation. We are over almost 2 million veterans and military families and supporters around the country, raising our voice to defend democratic values, push back. And we do that through the media, through the courts, through social media, and of course, in real time, out in the streets, and at events where we need to be. If folks are looking to learn more about the Insurrection Act, I have a Substack I posted on there earlier today about what's different about the Insurrection Act versus the other deployments we saw last year. It's just Janessa Goldbeck, if you're looking for me on Substack. And then if you really want to dive a little deeper into the Insurrection Act, we produced a documentary in last year called War Game. It's on Apple TV, Amazon, and a few other platforms. If you go to wargamefilm.com, you'll see all the places it's available. But it features a number of familiar faces, former Governor Steve Bullock, General Wes Clark, Senator Heidi Heitkamp, and a number of other folks you may recognize. Wargaming out. Thank you. I appreciate that. Wargaming out of the president deciding whether or not he should use the Insurrection Act. So it's a great entry point for folks if you want to learn a little bit more or don't know much about it.
Well, Jess, I appreciate it, and I love having you on, and I'm so glad that you stopped by to talk about it. I was actually looking for someone to talk about this when I heard back from Elizabeth. So I want to thank you again, and please come back again, because this is an important conversation, particularly the military and what you said about being trigger happy. That is my biggest concern as we go forward. The president of peace wants nothing but continuous war. And I don't know how you deal with that. That I really don't.
Gore
You
Vidal said it best: perpetual war for perpetual peace. I really appreciate the invitation, Brian, and I'll come back anytime.
All righty. Thanks a lot. This is Just Ask the Question. I am your host, Brian Karen. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you and the dogs next time. Is that your